A moment in history for the Soviet Union and the world. That's how Montreat's Billy Graham describes the celebration of the 1000th anniversary of the Russian Orthodox Church. The Soviet government invited Graham to join in the millennium. Last month, a News 13 crew followed North Carolina's most famous evangelist as he traveled to Moscow, Kiev, and Zagorsk. Ours was the only TV news organization in the world allowed to cover several of the events. During the next 5 nights, I'll look at the state of religion in the Soviet Union, at the message Graham brought to the people there and the reaction he received, and at the changing Soviet lifestyle. Tonight, we begin our special 5-part report with an overview of religion, where it's been and where it may be going. The Soviet Union is a land of beautiful churches, but the beauty belies a troubled history. After the Communist Revolution in 1917, the state seized control of the 48,000 Russian Orthodox churches, closing more than 40,000 of them. 50,000 priests, monks, and nuns were killed or sent to die in prison camps. New communist laws confined religious activity to the few churches that remained open. No longer were clergy allowed to minister to the sick or the poor, or to profess their faith publicly. Yet Christianity thrived, with at least 70 million modern Soviets describing themselves as believers.
The Orthodox Church, being 1,000 years old, has survived everything that's ever happened in this country. And it's quite amazing to me to see that same liturgy, how it has survived everything.
Now, 71 years after the revolution, there are signs of change, of hope. Graham and other religious leaders from across the globe gathered in the Soviet Union, celebrating Christianity's presence here. An event sponsored, ironically, by the Soviet government.
The eyes of the entire world are on this millennium. It is a celebration for all Soviet citizens, believers and non-believers alike.
For Billy Graham, this marked his 3rd official visit to the Soviet Union, his 4th overall. He spent 10 days preaching in both Orthodox and Baptist churches.
It is God's holy word.
Meeting with people on the streets and meeting in private sessions with high-ranking Soviet officials. In a meeting covered only by Graham's in-house production crew and News 13, the Soviet Minister for Religious Affairs told the American evangelist the state's view of religion is changing.
To those who sometimes say now that the Soviet Union doesn't appreciate the work of the clergy. Within the last 5 months, we have opened more than 150 communities, churches.
This also is a time of change on the streets of this country. Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika, Russian words for openness and restructuring, have many citizens hopeful better times are ahead. Billy Graham not only came to observe the church celebration, but also to see the changes for himself.
Now you're entering an entire new period of history in the Soviet Union. It's a new period in the history of the world.
Billy Graham last visited the Soviet Union in 1984. Have things changed? Reverend Graham shares his perspective with us tomorrow night when we take a closer look at the new policies of glasnost and perestroika.
What was it like for you there?
Oh, very interesting. It was a very interesting time. I think throughout the week people will see just how much the Soviet Union is changing, how the people's perspectives are changing, how the people feel about us Americans. I think it'll be an interesting week, and we'll also give you a glimpse of the Soviet lifestyle. Believe me, there's some interesting things in the Soviet Union.
Look forward to it.
Through glasnost and perestroika, Mikhail Gorbachev says he is out to restructure Soviet society, opening doors that have been closed for decades. But how far will the changes go, and will they release Russian churches from state control? Western North Carolina's Billy Graham was in the Soviet Union last month, and News 13 was there to bring back the story. Tonight in part 2 of my special report, a look at a changing Soviet society through the eyes of Graham and the Soviet people. On the busy streets of both Moscow and Kiev, there is a sense of an impending metamorphosis, a new beginning. A few people now sell goods on the streets of this communist country. On other streets, there is music in the air. The composer is Mikhail Gorbachev, and the melody is Glasnost. It means openness.
Well, I think it's very good, and I wish every success to it.
Glasnost didn't exist 4 years ago when Billy Graham last visited the Soviet Union. As he arrived last month at Moscow's Sheremetyevo International Airport, Graham said he was interested in seeing how much had changed since then, when the Soviet leader was Konstantin Chernenko, and there was no talk of restructuring society.
I especially look forward to learning more about the implications of these new policies for religious believers in every aspect of their lives.
We've told you a lot about the Soviet policies of perestroika and glasnost, restructuring and openness. In his sermons here in the Soviet Union, Reverend Graham stressed how life is changing for the Soviet people and how changes may be in store for their churches.
We hear a great deal today about glasnost.
Мы сейчас много слышим о гласности.
And one can come, a stranger like myself or a foreigner can come here to Moscow and see the changes.
Graham told this Russian Orthodox congregation he could see the most changes in the people themselves.
You can feel it.
Вы чувствуете это?
People seem more relaxed and there are more people smiling.
Люди свободнее.
And it warms my heart.
И это согревает мою.
Я думаю, все обстоят.
At Moscow's largest Baptist church, the message was the same.
Now you're entering an entire new period of history in the Soviet Union.
И теперь я ощущаю, что в Советском Союзе.
It's a new period in the history of the world.
Это будет новый.
Graham talked about other changes he witnessed. Soviet TV and radio covered religious events, unheard of in the past. Raisa Gorbachev, the wife of the Soviet leader, attended an all-day religious celebration at the Bolshoi Theater. A sign, says Graham, that the state is interested in and understands the importance of the church. A big change for Billy Graham, more freedom of movement. He met with people in Red Square.
We are from South Korea.
Oh, South Korea.
Yeah.
Well, I'm happy to see you.
And on the Arbat Street pedestrian mall. After moving among the Soviet people, Graham told me he's convinced the changes are more than just idle talk.
2 or 3 years ago, I couldn't have gone down a street like that and talked to people or shaken their hands. But today there's a relaxation. People are smiling. And glasnost is already working in its beginning stages, but it's working.
For most Soviet people, glasnost and perestroika are welcome concepts. Those we talked with say they've seen some changes, but they're still waiting to see how far-reaching they'll be.
Glasnost, I think that it's new politics and very good politics, more realism, more like politics of your authorities.
In some parts it's very quickly changing, in some parts it's just starting.
But for the several hundred religious dissidents jailed or hospitalized, glasnost and perestroika have the ring of empty words. This man says he was jailed because he's a Hare Krishna. The state only recently officially recognized that religion. He wonders if the changes are for real.
This glasnost and perestroika, I think that is for the foreign man, not for on the inside. Because if nobody is known widely, he have no, the glasnost and perestroika don't work on him.
How is life changing on the streets of Soviet cities? I'll examine that question and give you a glimpse of life in Moscow and Kiev tomorrow night as my special report continues.
What about changes in the way the Soviets deal with the foreign press? Did you have any problems at all taking pictures or?
Well, we'd heard a lot of war stories about guards and police breaking things up and walking in front of your cameras, telling you to get out of the way, and yet. But we never really had a problem. We had one time when we were chased by guards. We went inside of a grocery store, and because we didn't speak any Russian, we just basically walked in and started shooting some cabbage and lettuce, and we were chased out of there. But in general, the guards stayed away from us. They watched, but they didn't get in the way. Okay. Interesting time. We have more tomorrow night for you. Glasnost is a Russian word for openness. Perestroika means restructuring. We hear those two words a lot in America, but are things really changing in the Soviet Union? Last night we heard Billy Graham tell Soviet believers, quoting now, "You can feel the changes, and it warms my heart." Tonight, as I continue my special report, we take to the streets to see firsthand how life is changing in the USSR. For the first time in 7 decades, there are inklings of capitalism in this communist country. 2 or 3 years ago, you would have never seen this. A woman selling shoes on the street. And last night we showed you another new development, the Arbat Street Pedestrian Mall. It's a lot like a street market you'd find in America. People browsing and eating ice cream. Artists busy drawing portraits of bashful subjects. Paintings are for sale everywhere. And just like in the USA, you can find young people with loud tape players. Actually, this noise serves a purpose. These young Soviets are trying to sell tickets to an upcoming rock concert.
It's a tremendous change to me. It was just like a revolution had taken place in the Glasnost.
Other Americans who've been here before agree. Jarvis McMillan is a Presbyterian minister from Baltimore, whose parents live in Edneyville.
And the affect on the faces of the people in Moscow is markedly different. There's more color in their clothing, there's more humor, and there's an air of hope that was not at all present in '79.
We spent 3 hours, Mr. Gorbachev. It is not all show. He's real. Now, whether he can make it or not, it's a long leap to take, and he's under great pressure, naturally, but he's a very real person. And he listened, and I believe he genuinely believes what he's trying to do.
Glasnost is also making the streets more colorful. You now can find outdoor cafes scattered along sidewalks, along with Pepsi-Cola stands. The Pepsi here is a little flat and lukewarm. But what the Soviets really lack is good food. Good, at least by American standards. The meat is tougher and fattier than what we're used to. And vegetables, other than a ubiquitous Soviet cucumber, are virtually non-existent. But Moscow soon will offer more Americanized cuisine. Plans are underway for the first Soviet McDonald's and Pizza Huts. They open later this year. For tourists dying for American food, there is an oasis. This is called Astro Pizza. An American brought this van over. They make the pizza inside to order. And they bill it as the first American pizza in Moscow, but it'll cost you $15 in U.S. money. And no, they don't take Russian. In fact, most state-owned businesses catering to tourists take nothing but hard Western currency. And there are other quirks. For example, vending machines where you drink out of a communal glass. Military vehicles are everywhere, as are traffic cops. Jaywalking is a serious offense here. To get across the street, you must take an underground pedestrian tunnel. The Soviet Union does have its share of beauty. Moscow and Kiev offer marvelous historic architecture, although up close, much of it seems to be crumbling. We enjoyed our stay in Kiev best. The Dnieper River is that city's panoramic focal point. There are beaches, parks, and magnificent monuments.
Japanese camera. Yes, it was the type's tower.
But perhaps the Soviet Union's greatest treasure is her people. The Soviets can be pushy at times, but they're also warm, emotional people who reached out to us and made our trip one we'll never forget.
Well, they're very satisfied with your visit. They had a chance to... Well, не бойтесь.
Мы увидали вас. Мы очень довольны.
So they're very glad that they had a chance to see Americans.
Many of the Soviet people I talked with spoke of the future and peace between the superpowers. Tomorrow night, as my special report continues, we'll look at the role Billy Graham has played in the peace process.
This communal glass that they drink out of, I simply cannot get over this. Are there lines of people? Do they change it once, twice a day, maybe?
Well, it's much like, I guess, a newspaper stand in the United States. It kind of stands idle, and people just come by and drop coins into it. I did drink out of the communal glass, folks, and we have video to prove it, of course. So we have more for you tomorrow night and Friday night at 6 and 11. And then August the 7th, Sunday night at 8 o'clock, we'll be bringing you an hour-long special report, and we have video proof that I drank out of the communal glass, and I live to talk about it.
Okay.
Strange system, though. Some say it's the dawning of a new day in the Soviet Union. Over the past few nights, we've looked at how life is changing behind the Iron Curtain. But there are other important changes, changes that affect you and me. Prospects for superpower peace are better now than they've been in years. and I was part of a News 13 crew that was in the Soviet Union at an historic time. Less than 2 weeks after President Reagan and Soviet leader Gorbachev met in Moscow for this summit, Billy Graham and church leaders from around the world were in the same city for another first-of-its-kind event, the 1,000th anniversary of the Russian Orthodox Church, celebrated out in the open in a nation known for religious persecution. For Billy Graham, the issues of religion and peace are intertwined, and he told this gathering at the Bolshoi Theater the timing of the two events offers hope to people the world over.
During recent days, we've witnessed an extraordinary series of events that give promise of a more peaceful world.
The North Carolina evangelist has spent his entire life reaching out to people, close to home and far away. Graham says one thing he's learned in his nearly 70 years is no matter where you go, people are the same.
I think they have the same hopes and dreams and desires and the same sins. I mean, man is the same.
Mr. Reagan was right when he said at the university, the more we get to know each other, the less likely there'll be a war.
They had the summit meeting a few weeks ago.
And peace was a main theme in Graham's 4 sermons. He told this Kiev Baptist congregation that the religious festivities, coupled with the summit, are not going unnoticed in the West.
I know that it made a great impression on the American people and on people all over the world. And then we saw a picture of Mrs. Gorbachev and Mrs. Reagan holding hands walking across the road. Tonight I come to hold your hand too. In a spiritual dimension.
The attitude here does seem to be changing, and officials give Billy Graham some of the credit. The Soviet Minister for Religious Affairs told Graham his visits have helped bring the superpowers closer together.
And I may thank you cordially for your work, for your sermons, for your words which tend to unite people rather than divide them.
Another Soviet official told Graham his 1982 visit was a turning point in U.S.-Soviet relations.
If I made any contribution at all toward bettering our relations at a time when we have atomic bombs hanging over us like the sword of Damocles, then I'm very grateful to the Lord for giving me that opportunity.
And many Soviet people are grateful to Graham. This believer described Billy Graham as a friend of all people, a champion of peace.
He says it's very nice that several years ago Billy Graham said that the American government will change its attitude towards Russia. And we didn't believe at that time. We didn't think that it would happen. But really, in fact, it has happened. And we appreciate his hard labor.
Believers in the Soviet Union have a great love and respect for Billy Graham. Tomorrow night, I'll conclude my special report with a look at the reception Graham received and his reaction to this latest venture behind the Iron Curtain.
I noticed those large crowds. Is that something you all found day in and day out? You were there about 7 days?
A lot of people were just standing along roadsides watching the Millennium and the festivities involved, and when they knew where Billy Graham was going to be, it seemed the crowds were especially large. I ought to point out also, the people talked a lot about peace. Peace is a very important issue to the Soviet people, and I think Americans worry that Soviets don't think about peace. They definitely do. We'll have more for you tomorrow night.
Important to us, too.
To the Soviet people, Billy Graham may be a foreigner, but his name, face, and message are very familiar. The North Carolina Baptist recently completed his 4th trip to the Soviet Union, and News 13 was the only local news operation in the world to cover it in its entirety. Tonight, I wrap up my 5-part special report with some Soviet impressions of Graham and some final thoughts from the evangelist himself. He doesn't speak the language, and he hails from a nation that's long been considered the enemy. But it seems just about everywhere he goes, Billy Graham is recognized.
And I too am a Baptist.
Graham came to this Baptist church unexpectedly one Sunday morning. The parishioners didn't know they'd hear one of America's most famous evangelists, but they definitely knew the man.
So I have many wonderful memories of this church.
Well, he's a very nice person, and it gave him great joy. So she experienced great joy listening to him. Well, she used to listen to Billy Graham over radio. And her only dream was to see him in person.
Graham's sermons are sometimes carried on the Voice of America radio network. Between those broadcasts and his 4 visits, Billy Graham has become a familiar name here.
I've long heard of the great faith of the believers in the Ukraine.
Nowhere was that more apparent than at this Baptist church in Kiev. The sanctuary was tiny and the seating extremely limited. Because of that, many of the people who came to see Billy Graham had to be content with just hearing him. One ticket was good for a seat inside the church. Another allowed you to stand on the church grounds and listen to the service on a loudspeaker. But many had no ticket at all. They had to stand outside, behind a barricade, hoping to see and hear what they could.
We are happy to stand here. We'll wait when he will pass us by, and we will hear what we can from here.
Many of these people traveled hundreds of miles with the hope of seeing Billy Graham. These 2 men took a 10-hour train trip and came armed with tape recorders.
And they are the lucky ones who managed to come here, and they want to share their knowledge, to share what they hear with their friends back.
It's been more than a month now since Billy Graham returned to North Carolina. He's had some time to reflect on what he saw and experienced and share his perceptions. A little more than a month. Have you talked with President Reagan about your experiences there?
I have talked to him each time I've gone to the Soviet Union before I go, and I talked to him after I returned. And I told him what people said to me about his visit, what a positive influence he had been. Then to be followed almost immediately by the millennium of the Orthodox Church was really amazing. I think it was one of the most historical moments to be in the Soviet Union that we could ever be in this century.
Graham says he was most impressed by the change in the Soviet people. Glasnost, he says, appears to be creating a more open society and more open dialogue.
Before, I would go up to a group of people, if you remember, on that Arba Street, the pedestrian street. No one would shake hands with you. You know, you'd reach out and they just held back. At this time, there were a lot of smiles, a lot of people shook hands, and a lot of people reached over to shake hands.
Graham says Soviet officials assured him that people jailed for their religious beliefs are being released from prisons. Graham says Glasnost and Perestroika are creating some change, but it can't all happen overnight.
I don't think you can take a great ship and turn it on a dime in the Atlantic. It'll be a slow turn, but I think it'll be a turn.
Billy Graham says he hopes to return to the Soviet Union someday and see how much the ship has turned.
In past years, you've faced many difficulties.
These people have had to have a depth to their faith that maybe we don't have. They've had pressure under the Stalin period especially, but they survived. Not only survived, but they've grown.
But your faith has been strong.
I think that there's the possibility that the next great revival, spiritual awakening in the world, may come from the Soviet Union.
Deborah, Charlie, and I had a fascinating 10-day experience with Billy Graham and the Soviet people. Over the past 5 nights, we've looked at some of the highlights. Now, Sunday, August the 7th at 8 p.m., we'll take a broader look at life and religion in the Soviet Union in a special 1-hour news documentary. We hope you'll join us then.